All right. I'm trying to work on Dickie's computer here. Here we go. Yeah, okay, here we go. Dickie was having a hard time with her computer the other night, and we took it up to the Assemblies of God headquarters to the technical services people, and they got it going again. So we can use it tonight. We were looking at the temple, and last time we looked, maybe we haven't come there yet. This is Herod's second temple on the Temple Mount, a depiction of it, how it may have looked. You can see the courtyard of the Gentiles out on the outside part. And then as you go farther in, the spaces become more sacred and the admission becomes smaller. So you have the women and men, and then men only, and then priests only, and then high priest. This is the way the Temple Mount looks today. You will see the Dome of the Rock there where the temple used to stand. Of course, the Dome of the Rock is a Muslim mosque, and non-Muslims are not allowed to be there. This is the Western Wall, or also called the Wailing Wall, where the Jews go to pray. These stones that you see there are part of the retaining wall of the temple. They are not the temple itself. So Jesus said that not one of these stones would be left one on another, and that's true. Every stone of the temple was thrown down. The Romans did a really good job. However, part of the retaining wall is still there. And the Jews will go, they will write their prayers on pieces of paper, and they will stick the pieces of paper in between the blocks there. And there's a belief that if you do that, your prayer is going to be answered. I'm sure that not all are. This is the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. If you look to the left, you will see the southern steps that in Jesus' day were the main entrance onto the Temple Mount. And it is almost certain that Jesus stood right there. There are a few places where we can be quite certain that Jesus was, and this is one of them. There was a voluntary tax collected from all male adult Jews. The amount collected was 2 drachmas, or the equivalent of 2 denarii. The drachma is a Greek coin, and normally we see the denarius mentioned in the New Testament, but they were just about equal in value. The coin is mentioned in the New Testament for this, and it's called the didrachma, or the 2 drachmas, or half a Tyrian shekel. The coins that were used in the temple were the Tyrian shekel. And these are some that you can see here. Here are some Tyrian shekels that have been recovered from the 1st century. On the front was a portrait of Hercules, and on the back, an eagle clutching a ship. And when Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, perhaps he was offended at having the picture of a pagan god there in the temple of the true God. And there's a close-up of the Tyrian shekel. How many temples were there? Were there 2 or were there 3? Many consider Herod's temple as a 3rd temple, not as an extension of the 2nd temple. In fact, this period of Judaism up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is called Second Temple Judaism. Let's look here briefly at the synagogue. The synagogue became a key element in the preservation of Judaism. You know, when the Jews were taken captive to Babylon, the synagogue arose. It was a way that they perpetuated their religion. It was the social and educational center of the Jewish life, begun then and still continuing not only to the time of Christ, but to today. If we compare the temple with the synagogue, the key element in the temple was ritual sacrifice. The key element of the synagogue is the study of the law. In the temple, the priest was the main person. In the synagogue, it was the rabbi. In the temple, it represented the communal faith, and in the synagogue, the individual life. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the synagogue. We will look at the order of worship. As they gathered together, they had praise, prayer, and instruction. We are not exactly sure what the 1st century synagogue service was like, but probably it consisted of these elements. First of all, the invocation to God to join in the service. Secondly, a reading of a psalm as a call to worship. Third, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the reading of the 10 Commandments. We have the Barakot, or blessings, or the 18 benedictions, as it was called. And then prayer, the reading of the scriptures from the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms, a sermon, and then finally a blessing or benediction. This was the kind of service that Jesus attended during his lifetime. And he faithfully did that every Sabbath day. The synagogue had a tremendous influence upon the church. In fact, it has been said that Christian worship in its New Testament form was the result of the fusion of the synagogue and the upper room. They would come together, Christians would come together, they would read the scriptures, they would share in worship, and as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, some would come with a song, some would come with a revelation, a prophecy, and there was a lot of interaction in the church in the 1st century, in their worship service. They also would celebrate the Lord's Supper, and that comes from the upper room, where Christ told them to do this in remembrance of him until he comes. So we have the fusion of the two. You know, I was just thinking this week, I wonder if the Apostle Paul came back to 21st century, at least America, if not your country, and went to a church service, if he would recognize it. Or would he be very surprised that this was a church service? You would probably say, I've never been in a service quite like this. Because in America, the style now is to have lights focusing on the platform with the singers, the lights in the church itself very dimmed. You can't see who's sitting next to you. And You know, looking at worship in the first century church, that sure doesn't seem like it. And I think there's going to be a change coming up in the future. It may not be for a number of years, but I think there's going to be a change as we get back to a more biblical kind of worship and interaction. Do you have any questions or comments here? All right. Let's quickly look at the major festivals. Passover, this was the most important of the Jewish feasts or festivals. It was a celebration of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt. And our Easter falls in the Passover season. The festival of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. Pentecost gets its name because it takes place 50 days after Passover. Penteconta, 50. It marked the completion of the barley harvest and was at times called the Feast of Harvest or the Day of First Fruits. It was a day of joy and thanksgiving for God's blessings. In intertestamental times, it came to be associated with the giving of the law. The Feast of Trumpets, or the New Year, Rosh Hashanah. This was the Jewish civil New Year, a time of general rejoicing. The Day of Atonement. This came 9 days after Rosh Hashanah. It was a holy, solemn day, the only day when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies and offered sacrifices for the people. It was also the day that the scapegoat was driven into the desert, symbolically carrying away the people's sins. We have the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, it's called, also called the Feast of Booths or the Festival of Ingathering. This feast served as a reminder of the Jews sojourning in the wilderness. At the feast, they lived in booths or huts made of boughs of trees and palm branches. It also celebrated the close of harvest. The Feast of Lights, Hanukkah, also called the Feast of Dedication. Of the 7 feasts, this was the only one that had its origin in intertestamental times. It was established in 164 BC when Judas Maccabeus recaptured and cleansed the temple after it had been defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes. It was celebrated at about the time of Christmas. So I don't know how it is in your country, but in Christmas, we actually have 3 celebrations going on very close to one another. Of course, there's Christmas, there is Hanukkah, celebrated by the Jews, and there is Kwanzaa, celebrated by African Americans. Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. In the book of John, we are told that he celebrated the Feast of Dedication. And the last is the Feast of Purim. The origin of this feast is recorded in Esther 9. It comes from the word meaning lots. It was a national holiday on which the book of Esther was read. Okay, one thing I want us to look at is the concept of purity. This is important in the Gospels. To approach a holy God, one had to be holy and ritually clean. You know, every society has its own standards of purity. They differ from society to society. Now, some of those are for religious purposes, like with the Jews here. Some are simply social. There are standards of purity. Not everybody has the same standard. In some places, people don't bathe as often as in other places. which can be pretty offensive at times. And people might avoid those who don't bathe often because there's sometimes an odor. So what's acceptable in one country is not acceptable in another. When is it expected that a person will wash his hands? I grew up being taught that you should wash your hands pretty often, certainly after you go to the bathroom and before you eat, if possible. What kind of food is acceptable and unacceptable? What kind of dress is acceptable? And dress has social and religious implications here. The Bible says to be modest. What does it mean to be modest? Well, in one society, it would be one way, in another society, another. I heard about a missionary who, on a Sunday, he was in Japan, where the women's neckline is up around their neck, and their sleeves go all the way to their wrists. But their skirts were slit all the way up on the side to their hips. The next Sunday, he was in Africa, where the neckline was the waist, but their skirts went all the way to the ground. So, you know, if you would put a person from one of those cultures into the other, it would be very inappropriate. We all have our standards for what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. The Jews didn't distinguish between moral and ritual law. The same sacrifices were made for both moral and ritual offenses. For the Jews, some things were holy and some things were common or profane. To approach a holy God, a person had to be clean. There were some things that were clean and some that were unclean. The unclean could not come, into God's presence. When you read Leviticus, you see that there are all kinds of regulations for purity. There are clean and unclean foods. Eating food that had not been prepared according to kosher laws would make a person unclean. Bodily discharges, liquids that come out of the body, could make a person unclean. Touching a person who had touched a dead body could make a person unclean. Eating with a Gentile or entering a Gentile's home could make a person unclean. Now, in New Testament times, purity was extremely important. And the Pharisees took the regulations that applied to priests and broadened them to apply to everyone. One important ritual was to take a ritual bath, where you would go down into the water and bathe yourself, and symbolically you would cleanse yourself. Wherever archaeologists have discovered first century Jewish homes, they have found ritual baths called mikvaot. The singular is mikveh. Outside the temple, there were many mikvaot. And here is a picture of one down at the base of the temple, where people would go in and they would bathe ritually there and come out clean. Now, it was believed that ceramic and wooden vessels could become unclean, but stone vessels couldn't. So stone vessels were the preferred kind of vessels for Jews. In John 2, we are told of Jesus turning the water into wine, and there in John 6, it says, "Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. These were large vessels, and they were probably pretty much like these that are now in the Israeli Museum. These are made out of stone. They are not made out of pottery or wood. Other smaller vessels like cups and bowls were also made out of stone. They were made of soft limestone that you could turn on a lathe. And by turning it on a lathe, they could make it perfectly round. We read in the New Testament about the Pharisees demanding that the disciples of Jesus wash their hands before eating. It wasn't that they were concerned about the transmission of disease. It was rather a religious concern. And Mark gives an explanation. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Notice that when the leper comes to Jesus, he doesn't say, "Heal me." He says, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Make me clean." And Jesus doesn't say, "Be healed." He says, "Be clean." So there was very much a concern about ritual cleanliness. Now realize that this was not the way it was throughout the Old Testament or intertestamental times. It became a major issue starting a few years before Christ. And that is what we see in the New Testament. We also see that Jesus redefined purity. His disciples didn't always wash their hands, at least not according to the Pharisees' ritual before eating. Jesus said that he was Lord of the Sabbath. He called the temple, the most holy place for the Jews, a den of robbers. And Jesus wasn't afraid of becoming defiled. To touch a person with leprosy would make you defiled. But Jesus touched lepers and he wasn't defiled. Rather, they were made clean. So when the woman who had the issue of blood reached out and touched Jesus' garment, rather than making Jesus defiled, she was made clean. She was healed. When Jesus touched a young man who had died, Jesus wasn't made unclean. Rather, the young man rose to life. In the Old Testament, the unclean makes the clean unclean. In the New Testament, the clean makes the unclean clean. Have you noticed that contrast? Even in marriage, when a Christian is married to a non-Christian, Paul says that the unbelieving spouse is made holy by the believer, and the children are not unclean, but they are holy. It is like holiness is contagious. So this whole way of viewing purity and impurity is changed when we come to Scripture, especially when we see it in the life of Christ. For the Christian, purity is more internal than external. But internal purity will show itself in holiness of life. Okay, do you have questions or comments here before we go on?
Prophet Dr. Garland?
Yes, Masha.
There is the bath, stone bath, bathing.
Yes.
That is related with baptism?
No, it's not. It's not really baptism.
Different?
It's different. It's cleansing. And so the Jews did have proselyte baptism. When a person became a Jew, proselyte. The word proselyte describes a person, a Gentile, who becomes a Jew.
So before Jesus came here, already the baptism was common ritual, although this different from this one.
Yes.
Okay.
Jews did not undergo baptism. Jews were not baptized. It was Gentiles who became Jews, and part of that ritual was to undergo proselyte baptism. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Okay,
So,
thank you.
There would be baptism, there would be instruction, there would be sacrifice in the temple, and there would be circumcision. And a Gentile would go through those 4 steps and become a Jew. So Jews were not baptized. These mikvaot, these ritual baths, were a way of cleansing. It was a cleansing ritual that they went through, and they had them in there. Yes?
Ritual bath is used by Jews, but the Jews did not be baptized, was not baptized.
That is right. That is right.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, unless they became Christians and then they received Christian baptism.
Okay? Professor, I have a question.
Yes, Jason.
You said in the Old Testament, the unclean makes the clean unclean, and what factor makes the turn?
I'm sorry. Repeat that. Repeat that, Jason.
I want to know what factor makes the turning from Old Testament to the New Testament about the purity.
I think it was Jesus. I think it was Jesus himself. Do you mean that, like we say here in the Old Testament, the unclean makes the clean clean, the clean unclean?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
It would be Jesus himself. When Jesus comes, it's reversed. So that when Jesus touches an unclean person, he doesn't become unclean. The person he touches becomes clean.
I think in the Old Testament, the ritual is just a symbol, right? But the purity from Jesus is the reality.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it. In the Old Testament, they they went through a process of becoming clean. And so once they had gone through that process, then they were considered clean. But you might say, I think maybe you're saying, Jason, that in reality, the cleansing comes from Jesus. But it didn't come until Jesus came. So in a sense, they were looking forward to the coming of Jesus. Just like when they offered sacrifices, it was a type or a prefigurement of the perfect sacrifice that would come in the future, which was Jesus. Okay, yeah.
And now, do we have the ritual purity in the New Testament?
What are you thinking of?
Because Jesus brought the purity for us. So I want to know whether the ritual has been, how to say, abandoned.
Yes, yes. The ritual has been abandoned. Now, it could be that in the early years, when the early Christians who were Jews were still attending the temple, it could be, and I don't know, but it could be that some of them continued with those kinds of rituals. But in time, it became clear that the coming of the Messiah changed everything. So why would you offer sacrifice in the temple when the perfect sacrifice has already been offered? So the coming of the Messiah, the death and resurrection of Christ, was something that changed everything, really, for the people of God.
But in the New Testament, Paul says our praise is a kind of sacrifice, right? I think that's a ritual in the New Testament.
I don't know that I would call it a ritual. I would call it simply praising God. And, our praise arises before the throne as a sweet smelling odor before the Lord, just like the sacrifices in the Old Testament did. So, yeah, I guess there's a parallel between praise in the New Testament and the sacrifices of the Old. So we do offer the sacrifice of praise, but not in a ritualistic kind of sense.
Yes.
Yeah, it's something that comes from our heart, and we commune with God, and it's on a different level from offering those sacrifices in the temple.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Yes, Dr. Galen, I had a question. Like when you talk about purity, and you talk about that every other cultures have different definition or standard of purity. Does that mean like if some we like in the Old Testament in the book of Leviticus when you can find every unclean animals and what's clean and what's not clean.
Right.
And some of those stuff are not applicable to us that are not Jewish people.
That's right. In the Gospels, it said Jesus declared all foods clean. So we are no longer under the food laws of the Old Testament. The Old Testament served its purpose in bringing us to Christ. And now that we have come to Christ, we are no longer under those ritualistic ceremonial laws, but we are freed from those.
I think it just comes down to the correct teaching of the Bible, because like some other cultures, they still practice this because if it's in the Bible, then they believe that everything that's in the Bible needs to be practiced. So maybe it just comes down to sound doctrine.
Well, it depends on your view of the Old Testament. And I would look at basically three ways of looking at that. There are the typical Calvinist position is that we should do everything in the Old Testament that is not repealed in the New. So there's quite a bit in the Old Testament that we should keep, according to the Calvinists. According to many modern people today, including most Pentecostals, the only thing from the Old Testament that we are commanded to keep are the commands to love God and love your neighbor and the 10 Commandments. Those are renewed in the New Testament. There are some midway ways of looking at it. Like we keep the Old Testament in a sense that it is through Christ now that we keep those things. But we are not, in my opinion, I'm not a Calvinist, And we are not under obligation to keep all of the ceremonial, ritualistic rules and civil rules of the Old Testament. We are obligated to keep the moral rules. So the moral laws. Even though the Old Testament itself does not differentiate from between the moral and the ritual. I don't know. Does that make sense, Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Galen. I mean, I learned that from how our hermeneutics class.
Right.
Just thinking like maybe something that might come up, and how would I best answer it to somebody that asked that maybe in the church or something like that.
Yeah, well, you could direct him to the verse in Mark where it says Christ declared all foods clean. And then you could go to Paul and see the things that he says about this. So you can't do it simply by looking at the Old Testament. It has to be the New Testament interpretation of the Old Testament.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Other questions or comments? All right. Let us go on then. We'll briefly look at Judaism's literature. There were three classifications of writing for the Jews of the New Testament era. The first is, of course, their scriptures. Their scriptures in the Hebrew Bible. It's divided up into three different parts: the law or the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, and then the prophets, divided into former prophets and latter prophets. And the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Samuel is 1 book, Kings is 1 book. And while most of us would call these books history, in the Old Testament, they are called the former prophets. And then we have the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then what we call the minor prophets, the book of the 12. And then the third major category is the writings. We have the poetic books of Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, the 5 scrolls, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther, and the historical books of Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So this is the way that the Old Testament was divided up. And when Jesus encountered the people on the Emmaus Road, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, before they knew he was resurrected, it says that he taught them what the scripture said about Christ from the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And there we have the 3 different groupings of the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament was also in Greek. It was translated into Greek. It was called the Septuagint version, abbreviated with the Roman numeral 70, LXX. And it was widely used in the Greek-speaking world. In fact, in the New Testament, it was the main version that was used by the Greek-speaking authors of the New Testament. These are the books that we have from 2 of the major codexes, manuscripts from the 4th and 5th century. And you can see how they appear here in those codexes. These are actually Christian codexes. They also have the New Testament as well. There is also the Apocrypha. There are several works which were written after the Hebrew scriptures, which were used by Jews in the 1st century and have been used by the church since that time. This is the Old Testament Apocrypha. Apocryphal books appear in several of the Greek codices of the Old Testament and New Testament from the 4th and 5th centuries. The Roman Catholic Church includes the Apocrypha in their scriptures. We may call them deuterocanonical. They are in the scriptures, but not seen as fully inspired the way the Old Testament is. The Protestant Church has rejected the Apocrypha, and it is not part of the Protestant New Testament or Protestant Bible. And here are some of the works of the Apocrypha. You can see that they have different names. It's the way they are in the Revised Standard Version, and then the names in the New American Bible. It is interesting to read these. They are very interesting stories. Some of them give us good history. Some are inspirational and edifying, but not inspired. In your syllabus, there is a link to the Apocrypha if you want to get it online. And then we have the pseudepigrapha, works from a later time. Some of them were discovered in Qumran. Some of them were discovered in later discoveries. Many of them are apocalyptic. And I have on here the names of various works in this, but I'm not going to take time to read them. You can do that at your leisure. I would like to mention, though, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, these are important for studying the life of Christ. They give us good background on 1st century Judaism. The term refers to documents that were found in 1947 in 11 caves on the west shore of the Dead Sea. Actually, recently, they have found a 12th cave, but nothing really of any value there. The one in the picture here is cave number 4. And I took that picture when I went to Qumran a few years ago. The documents belong to an Essene community living in the little area called Qumran near the Dead Sea. These documents are believed to come from the 2nd century BC up to the year AD 68. They're valuable in the study of the New Testament because they give insight into one Jewish community around the time of Christ. Up until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest Old Testament manuscript that we have came from about the year 1000 AD, 1,000 years after Christ. But then the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, which takes us back another 1,000 years older. And it testifies to the fact that the Old Testament manuscripts in Hebrew were handed down very accurately. Okay, do you have any questions or comments here before we go on? Okay. I'm just going to briefly mention the Talmud. We saw Ezra in the Old Testament there, who was, we would say, the first scribe. The scribes became the experts at the interpretation of Scripture, and they made comments on passages, and this commentary was collected into a body of teaching called the Talmud. The Talmud was composed of two parts. The Mishnah, which is oral law and elaboration of scripture, and it came into existence up until the 2nd century. And the Gemara, which was the interpretation of the oral law and originated in the 3rd century AD and later. There were two kinds of interpretation of the Mishnah and Gemara. The Halakha dealt with the law code, and the Haggadah dealt with everything else, general preaching. Two other sets of documents are important for us in understanding the 1st century Jewish background. The first is that of Josephus. Josephus lived in the 1st century AD, and he wrote several documents that give us insight into Judaism at that time. He was a Jew who adopted many of the ways of the Romans. In fact, he lived in an apartment in the Roman emperor's house. He has written 4 works that give us the history of the Judaism of the 1st century, especially his account of the Jewish war. The other set of documents is from Philo. He was a 1st century Jewish writer from Alexandria. He combines literal and allegorical interpretation with the stress being on the allegorical. At certain places, there are scholars who think they can see Philo's influence on the New Testament. I really doubt that that is true. Okay. I want to mention apocalyptic because this is a concept that we'll come across frequently as we study the New Testament. The word apocalyptic can refer to either a kind of literature or a kind of eschatology within that literature. You could have apocalyptic eschatology in writings that would not be considered apocalyptic in style. Also, apocalyptic can be a noun or it can be an adjective. Apocalyptic literature is distinguished from prophetic literature, but at times they are blurred together. So when you read the Old Testament prophets, there are apocalyptic sections that we see there, especially in Daniel and in Ezekiel, Zechariah, even though we wouldn't consider those books to be apocalyptic books. In apocalyptic literature, the writer would give an account of a vision he had had. So there is no "thus saith the Lord" that we find in the prophets. The apocalyptic prophets were writers rather than preaching prophets. They also wrote in the name of famous Old Testament characters such as Enoch or Elijah. And we call that pseudonymity, writing in somebody else's name. Now, if you go back and you look at those books that are in the pseudepigrapha, you will see Elijah, Enoch, Noah, other Old Testament heroes that appear there and supposedly wrote those. They also, the apocalyptic literature used vivid imagery, beasts with multiple horns and heads, and so forth. Their eschatology had nothing to do with history. The Old Testament prophets saw a relationship between history and the time when God would intervene in history. Not so with the apocalyptic writers. History was a dead-end street. We just need to hang on until God intervenes. So it's different. The apocalyptic literature is different. During the intertestamental period time, when apocalyptic really began flourishing, it was a time of great frustration for the Jewish people. For a while, they had their freedom, but then they lost it again. And they looked to God for deliverance. But when it didn't come, there was frustration because they believed that if they were righteous, God would free them. God would prosper them. And they felt like they had done all they could. And so it was like they gave up. And they had visions of the end time when God would come on the scene and judge the world. In the New Testament, the book of Revelation is the only apocalyptic style book. But it doesn't fit all these criterion that we're looking at for apocalyptic here. It does use the imagery. It uses the beasts, the heads, the horns, the lightning, and all of that. But it comes from a genuine encounter with the writer and Jesus Christ himself. And that is unlike the apocalyptic writers in intertestamental Judaism. Okay, do you have any questions or comments here? Any question or comments on Jewish literature or anything else that we've covered here?
The people or the books were in Jerusalem or in another areas? It is spreaded or just for, was in only Jerusalem?
Probably the apocalyptic writings were circulated. Now, I don't think there was a central library where the apocalyptic writings were kept.
Not only the apocalypse, the persons and Talmud teachers, they were spread in the time, or they gathered in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I believe that they were probably not centralized in Jerusalem.
Okay.
But they were in other areas.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, let's look briefly then at the parties of Judaism. Josephus tells us that there were 3 parties in the time of Jesus. He says, moreover, when I was a child and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning, on which account the high priests and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of the law. So here Josephus is saying, at the age of 14, the experts in the law came to me to find out what I thought about it, because I had such accurate understanding. There's no sense of humility here, I don't think. And when I was about 16 years old, I had a mind to make trial of the several sects that were among us. These sects are 3. The first is that of the Pharisees, the second, that of the Sadducees, and the third, that of the Essenes, as we have frequently told you. For I thought that by this means I might choose the best. Josephus needed to select a party or a sect that he would be a member of, and he chose the Pharisees. In another writing, he describes a 4th party, which is the Zealots. First of all, let's just point out that most Jews did not belong to any of these sects. Most belonged to the masses, called the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. These people were looked down on by those who held places of respect in these parties. And Jesus was looked down on because he associated with these common people. Okay, I believe that it's time for a break. So let's take a quick break here and we will come back in 10 minutes. All right, are we all here? All but Jason, okay. The first party that just want to look at, and we'll try to do this very quickly, is that of the Pharisees. The Pharisees probably came from a group in the intertestamental times called the Hasidim, who were, which means the holy ones, those who followed a strict order of holiness during the time of the Hasmonean rulers. They were zealous for keeping the law of Moses. They resisted the corrupt priests who ruled the nation without a great commitment toward God. And probably this is where the Pharisees came from. Josephus said, "These are a certain sect of the Jews that appear more religious than others, and they seem to interpret the law more accurately." Now, that would certainly seem to describe the Pharisees of the New Testament, of Jesus' day. They were they put great importance on interpreting the law very accurately, and also they held to the tradition of the elders, that law, that sort of a fence around the law that made it even harder to keep. Okay, let me just say that the Pharisees were very strict in keeping the law. And we can see that in the Gospels. Metzger gives 4 major beliefs of the Pharisees. One was foreordination. The Pharisees held to this doctrine and considered it to be consistent with one's free will, but that God had foreordained the things that happen. Second, immortality and resurrection. The Pharisees believed that we are immortal, that we will continue living after death, and that our bodies will be raised. And almost all Jews believed this. The exception would be the Sadducees. Third, angels and demons. They had a developed angelology and demonology at this time. And fourth, the scriptures and oral traditions. So the supreme authority in religion was the written Hebrew scriptures and the oral tradition that comprised an accumulated body of pronouncements of Jewish teachers down through the generations. So these this tradition, the tradition of the elders, was put on the same level as the law. In your PowerPoint, I give you a description of the Pharisees from Metzger. I'm not going to take time to read it just because of time,